It's not your imagination. New vehicles have become significantly less affordable over the last decade, and even over the last few years. In 2024, there were only 10 new vehicles you could buy out the door, including sales tax, license, etc., for under $25,000, and that list has shrunk by about half for 2025. But one of the newest 2025 vehicles that you can still buy for under $25,000 is this, the new Nissan Kicks. Its price tag ranges from $23,220, including destination, but not sales tax, on up to the fully loaded model, which is what we're looking at today, for $31,710. So if you're looking for a small crossover that has lots of practicality, a fresh, clean new design, big screens on the inside, and finally, optional all-wheel drive, you might want to check out the 2025 Nissan Kicks. Let's talk about which trim you might want to get and how it stacks up against those other affordable vehicles in North America. Even though the Kicks is Nissan's most affordable SUV, they opted to give this a complete redesign for 2025 rather than simply a heavy refresh of the existing model. That means we get a completely new interior, new engines, and new transmissions. It's riding on a new platform that now supports all-wheel drive, and it debuts Nissan's new design philosophy up front. Interestingly, it's launching on the Kicks rather than something like the Murano. And that means that, in a way, the Murano looks more like a pumped-up Kicks than this looks like a deflated Murano, simply because of the timing of the launch. Nissan also decided to stuff a lot of standard feature content on the Kicks, like full LED headlights in every trim, including the base model. This one is, of course, the top-end SR trim. We get a few more shiny black plastic bits around, but largely they look the same. One of the things you'll find on the top-end trim, however, is front parking sensors well integrated into the bumper. You won't find those in the lower-end trims, but interestingly, all models have rear parking sensors. Let me know what you think of the design down there in the comments section. I appreciate the really slim full LED turn signals here, and I also kind of like the LED accents. They go well with the multi-blade Gillette-style grille going on up front. I'm also glad that Nissan gives us the surround view camera in the Kicks, although obviously that's going to be the top-end trim, but I'm not clear how well this shiny black plastic grille is going to hold up over time. From tip to tail, the new Kicks is just under 172 inches long, but Nissan decided to give this a very boxy design, which makes it feel a bit bigger than it really is. We also have a relatively short hood that really maximizes the interior practicality. We see the same sort of design philosophy, of course, different shapes, going on in the Ford Bronco Sport. That also feels a lot bigger than it really is. Something that is certainly bigger than the Kicks, though, that is the Honda HR-V. It's a whopping 8 inches longer than this. The Chevy Trax, it's also longer, about 7 inches from tip to tail longer than this model. Now, the HR-V, it has pretty similar interior volume. The big difference is it has a much longer hood, and that hood is not giving you more space on the inside, but it does give that HR-V a bigger presence out on the road. The roofline, that's the biggest difference between this and the Trax. The Trax is a little bit lower, and it feels more like a stretched wagon than an SUV. It also does not have the one thing that a lot of folks had been asking for with the new Kicks, which is the availability of all-wheel drive. It's not standard, but it is available in every trim, essentially. You'll notice that they do cut the rear cargo capacity a little bit by giving us this raked glass, but then after that, we have a very vertical rear end. Depending on the trim, you'll find 16, 17, or 19-inch wheels on the Kicks. Since this is the SR trim, we have the 19-inch wheel with this very triangular motif. We also have the widest tires available, 225 millimeters wide. But the bigger difference is the fact that this is the all-wheel drive model, which means we get an independent suspension in the back. This is one of the few in this segment. If you get front-wheel drive, you'll find a torsion beam suspension in the rear. If you get all-wheel drive in any trim, it goes to a fully independent multi-link setup. Now, Nissan has sometimes described this as a semi-independent rear suspension. In the truest sense of the word, it's the same suspension that we find, for instance, on the Kona and the other entries in this segment, where they say it's an independent suspension, so I'm just going to go ahead and call it fully independent as well. Moving around to the back, I have to say I was surprised that we find full LED taillights back here, because most of the competition, even if the brake lights are LEDs, the rest is an incandescent element. And here we have LED backup lights, LED turn signals, etc., and of course the LED brake lights all integrated into this module as well. Down at the bottom of the bumper, we have a painted insert. SR trim, of course, keep that in mind, and one exhaust tip tucked up under the bumper. Nissan wanted the new Kicks to feel like a shrunken version of the Nissan family rather than a penalty box like sometimes the first generation Kicks could. And that's why not only do we find features like the full LED headlights, we find a ton of active driver assist tech standard, including adaptive cruise control, autonomous emergency braking with pedestrian detection, and blind spot monitoring standard as well. And then of course those rear parking sensors I mentioned earlier. The blind spot monitoring part is intriguing because a lot of the competition that includes adaptive cruise control, they chose to give you adaptive cruise control instead of blind spot monitoring, and you have to add that on later, whereas Nissan decided to give you both right from the start. Now, there is still a small list of optional features like the front parking sensors and lane keeping assist, but honestly, you could be just fine with the base setup. It wasn't really that long ago that a 10 to 12 second 0 to 60 time was considered perfectly normal, but this is 21st century America, where we are demanding more and more power under the hood of a new car. And that's why when Nissan decided to add all-wheel drive to the Kicks, they also realized they needed to add more power to compensate for the added weight. And this vehicle can now get up to about 3,300 pounds of curb weight. So gone is the 1.6-liter four-cylinder, and in its place is a 141 horsepower 2-liter four-cylinder. Still pretty modest on the power output, but that can get this 0 to 60 in just under 10 seconds. Honestly, a pretty average performance time for this particular category. The CVT, it's also new under here. If you don't want a CVT in your next small affordable vehicle, you don't have too many options. You could look at something like the Mazda CX-30 that does have a 6-speed automatic transmission. It also has a turbocharged engine available, but you're going to pay a lot more for it than this Nissan Kicks. You can also look at a Chevy Trax, but it's not going to have all-wheel drive even available in that model. And it's going to trade a 4-cylinder naturally aspirated engine for a 3-cylinder turbo. So you do have some choices to make. Fuel economy though, that's pretty decent considering this isn't a hybrid. You'll get 30 miles per gallon if you choose the all-wheel drive model. That bumps up by 1 mpg if you choose the front-wheel drive option. Bearing in mind we are driving the very top-end SR trim, I'll move this seat really close so you can see what's going on here. We do still have a fully manual seat design. So this is not one of the small crossovers that migrates you up into powered seats for the top trim. Again, keep the price tag in mind. We do, however, have a manual tilt telescopic steering column with a pretty decent range of motion. The downside to the all-manual seat design is that this seat is simply not as adjustable as the options that offer a powered seat. And no version of the Kicks is going to get an adjustable lumbar support for the driver's seat. That's something that definitely became a problem for me over this last week in the Kicks. When driving this for more than an hour or two at a time, I was really missing adjustable lumbar support. You could put a cushion back there yourself, of course, but that's something I would really love to see right from the factory. On the other hand, the boxy design and the relatively high roofline, up front at least, allows the driver or the front passenger to sit more upright, giving the rear passengers effectively more rear legroom. We find just under 78 inches of combined legroom in here, so this is by no means class leading. It actually is towards the middle or lower end of the segment, but I think it's pretty rational still for a family of 4, as long as you don't have kids in rear-facing child seats, because there was just no way for me to accommodate them safely behind me at 6 feet tall up front. Also, trying to put one of those rear-facing child seats between folks up front, that could get tricky just due to the general dimensions and width that we have in the Kicks. This is a little bit wider than before, but it's still on the narrow side, especially compared to something like a Nissan Rogue. This seat is all the way back in its tracks, and there is just a hair of legroom there, but you'll notice that headroom, that's the more limiting factor if you get the panoramic moonroof, because the way that this panoramic moonroof goes all the way back here to practically my forehead means that if you're sitting in a more average seating position, you'll find your hair or your head rubbing on this seat section right there. Most people are not leaning all the way back, where we find about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of headroom. They're really going to be a little bit further forward, where this particular profile and design becomes a bit more of a problem. The rear seats, though, they fold in a 60-40 fashion, with the 60% side over here on the passenger side, 40% side right there behind the driver, and they do fold almost completely flat with the cargo area in the back. We also get an armrest with cup holders for the rear passengers. Cargo capacity behind the manual hatch is going to depend on the trim level you select, whether you get all-wheel drive or front-wheel drive, and which option boxes you've ticked. Because a spare tire is available in the Kicks, although this model does not have one. In North America, spare tires are becoming less and less common, so Nissan gives us a removable foam cargo divider in the place of that spare tire. However, all of the fixing points for a spare tire are baked in from the factory. So if you want to add one, you can easily do that to any version of the Kicks. The reason cargo capacity will vary from 30 cubic feet in the base model down to 23.9 in a fully loaded all-wheel drive trim is going to be because of the available spare tire and the fact that we get a different rear suspension in the all-wheel drive models. So exactly how much cargo capacity you're going to get, just keep those options in mind. We're going to get a hard cargo cover here in all trims. I do find this a little bit less practical than a soft roller style cover because there's really no good place to put it. It will sit flat on the floor, but then you'd be stuffing your luggage on top of that cargo cover. Regardless of the version you get, we were able to squeeze 4 24-inch roller bags back here in our roller bag test. Keep in mind that the difference between the trims is going to be the effective height, available height of the cargo area in the back. And in our roller bag test, we never put those roller bags above the rear head restraints. You probably could put some small luggage up there, however, if you were to get the model with the deepest storage well available. As we look around this interior together, keep in mind two things. The Kicks is one of the least expensive new vehicles in North America for 2025, but this is also the most expensive $31,000 trim. So we have a sunglasses holder right there, LED map lights, controls for the big panoramic moonroof, slide to the side sun visors for the driver and front passenger, and both sides do have lights and a mirror, just in case you're wondering right there. The panoramic moonroof, it's not the biggest in the segment, but you can see it goes to just about the rear passenger's laps. And again, here you can really see that cut in right there for rear seat headroom. But if the person's sitting in a more natural position, they're going to be quite close to that lower portion of that ceiling area. Over here, we have the Bose personal audio system. You can see that logo right there on the head restraint. Versus the 2024, where we found just the surround speakers for the driver, we now have driver and front passenger surround speakers for 2025. We have height adjustable shoulder belts, lots of contrasting stitching going on in this model. It's a combination leatherette and cloth interior, so gray and red striping there, red accents on the middle of the seat. It's a little bit difficult to see on camera, but it has kind of an interesting 3D effect where how much red you see depends on exactly where the camera is pointed, and it does fade from being all gray at the top to more red down there at the bottom. I think it's actually quite an attractive look for an inexpensive vehicle. And Nissan definitely decided to spend some extra time and give some of these surfaces more texture than they had before. Like this, I guess you'd say carbon fiber-esque woven texture on that soft touch material there on the armrest of the door, more of that contrasting stitching. We of course still find plenty of hard plastics, like around that door handle there, around the bottom of the door where we find those bottle holders. But we do also find a surprising amount of soft touch materials, like the upper portion of the door panel there in that soft touch stitched material. And that continues on over to the dashboard, where we find kind of a two-level dash, I guess you'd say. Soft touch materials up top, more of that same soft touch material on the doors here in the midsection. As you'd expect, hard plastics happen down lower on the dashboard, but I do appreciate the soft touch materials and the way they dress up the interior a bit more. We have a shiny black plastic strip that wraps all the way around to that air vent over there. That's probably going to get really scratched over time. But we do have a big glove compartment here. It's a really deep bin and slot style compartment. I was able to fit an 11-inch tablet computer pretty easily inside. I suspect even larger ones would fit in. Now, speaking of tablets, we have two big screens in the dashboard. This is again the top end model, so we have the 12.3-inch screen here and the 12.3-inch screen over there. The base version is going to have a 7-inch touchscreen in the middle that will not support CarPlay or Android Auto. That is one big bummer in the base model. If you step up one trim, you get this screen and you get CarPlay and Android Auto support. As you can see, it takes up most of the screen right there. And the native interface is one of the newer software interfaces we've seen in the Nissan lineup. So very similar to what we saw in Nissan's latest EVs and the upcoming Armada, etc. It doesn't support factory navigation, but we do have some duplicate controls for the climate controls right there. Of course, the main climate control bank, that's down here at the bottom. Touch controls for most of those functions right there, although there are some physical buttons here for track forward, backward, a direct access button for the 360-degree camera, and it features moving object detection as well. Down here, we find the engine start-stop button, 2 USB inputs. This system supports wireless CarPlay or wireless Android Auto, but I have the wired connection connected at the moment because I prefer that. We have the electric parking brake there, auto brake hold, and a Depeche mode switch. Just kidding, that's actually the drive mode, although I'm not quite clear how many meetings was required to actually abbreviate D mode when there's probably enough room there for drive mode or just drive. We have a pretty standard shifter here. Red accents, or sort of, I guess, coppery red accents, you might say. and really, truly huge cup holders. This is really a good indication of the fact that this was definitely designed for North America, just the size and scale of those cup holders. They're also nicely far apart, so you don't have any problem putting those big takeout drinks there, and they're not going to stick up that much above the center console. So it does make the armrest here in the middle easier to use. Lots of contrasting stitching going on there, and actually a soft touch insert so that way your knee's not banging on hard plastic. Inside we find an itty bitty little storage area. It's so small I almost wonder if it would have been better to just skip that and maybe give us a third cup holder or something odd like that. Let's move on over to the dashboard, where you can see that these screens are definitely kind of tablet-like in their integration into the dashboard, so no separate binnacles. Over here we have the dimmer control. I actually like the fact that that's actually a physical switch rather than being buried in the software. And this uses basically the same instrument cluster software that we find in the Rogue. So we have a bunch of different views. You can see we have more of a sporty layout with these horizontal gauges here, or you can go for that dial theme there. And then you can roll through lots of various information in this vehicle, trip computer information, tire pressure readouts, Apple CarPlay readouts, etc., that sort of thing. Moving out from there, we find a flat bottom steering wheel, also very similar to what we find in the Rogue. Over here, we find the controls for the adaptive cruise control. Again, that is standard. The new white Nissan logo right there, and then volume, track forward, backward controls, etc. Pretty logically laid out. On this side, we find the controls for the heated steering wheel and the steering assistance system. The first thing we need to address out on the road is the 0 to 60 time, because in my first review of the Kicks, I apparently transposed the numbers, and I said this went 0 to 60 in 7.9 seconds, when it really should have been 9.7 seconds. So big apology to everybody out there, but that is one of the reasons that we try and get these vehicles back at home to do our full instrumented testing, rather than trying to rush around and do it all within the space of an hour or two at a launch event. This model went 0 to 60 in 9.6 to 9.7 seconds, depending on the test run that we were looking at, and it got a little bit quicker if you started from a complete stop, because if I do stop here, for instance, and then I just floor it, eventually the engine will rev up here enough, 6,000 RPM, and it's just going to hang out there and accelerate. That dropped the 0 to 60 time by about 0.2 of a second, and around 9.4 seconds. Not the swiftest entry, but honestly not too far removed from most of the competition, as long as we're talking about the base engines. Now, if we're not starting from a stop, doesn't matter what drive mode we're in, we'll make sure we're in sport here, for instance, and I hit the accelerator pedal, it's going to imitate shifts, and that makes it feel a little bit more pleasing to some, but it also means that 0 to 60 is going to take a little bit longer. As far as the braking distance goes, that's respectable, bearing in mind that we are driving the heaviest version of the Kicks with all-wheel drive, but also the model with the widest tires. This model took 119 feet to stop from 60 back to 0, and the stopping doesn't really have any drama in it. Brakes actually feel really well modulated. There is a reasonable amount of tip and dive, just as you'd expect in an affordable vehicle, but on a fun road like this, the braking effort and the braking responsiveness felt just about right. Thanks to the independent suspension in the back in this all-wheel drive model, this is the kind of vehicle you can drive an awful lot harder than you might think. Of course, you're gonna have to wait for the engine to do its thing if you want to speed up around the corner, but it does actually have a pretty solid feel to it. When it comes to handling, I'm gonna give this an A-. There are a few options with a slightly better feel. I would say actually that the very top-end version of the Chevy Trax is an awful lot of fun, and that 3-cylinder engine is not a problem for me at all. The big thing with the Trax is that it has some crazy wide tires in the top-end trim. They're more or less average for this segment, but the independent suspension definitely helps things out. Out on a gravel road like the one that we're on here, ride quality is pretty solid, and when you encounter bigger bumps like that one, the suspension really does a good job of not only soaking those bumps up, but also making sure that the rear suspension does not become unsettled, something that we see in, for instance, the Mazda CX-30. Even though you can get a significant amount more power in the CX-30 with that turbo engine, and the price tag gets an awful lot higher than this model, it doesn't have something that we find in the Kicks, and that is that independent rear suspension. You will notice it not only on rougher gravel roads like this, but also freeway expansion joints, a less than perfectly paved winding mountain road where you'd really want to explore the limits of that turbocharged CX-30. This has a much more elegant feel to the rear suspension. It just doesn't have as much power. Then, of course, you're really going to notice the all-wheel drive system. If we put this in the snow mode, that's where you're going to feel the most sure-footed traction. Interestingly, there's no off-road mode for this system. And even if I come to a complete stop here and then floor it again, no fuss, no muss, you accelerate, no problem with traction. That's the big benefit for the 2025 Kicks over a 2024. Nissan says they expect a decent number of Kicks to be all-wheel drive because, as we've seen with other manufacturers, when you get above the snow line in the United States, maybe about Tennessee or so, sales of front-wheel drive vehicles like the previous generation Kicks, they really fall off a cliff. It remains to be seen exactly how many more Kick shoppers they get with the addition of all-wheel drive, but it's a safe bet you're going to be seeing more of these in the Pacific Northwest or in the Northeast. The Kicks definitely has an interesting combination of attributes. 0 to 60 times are on the slow side of normal, 6 to 0 stopping distances are on the short side of normal, handling is above average, ride quality pretty comparable to the mainline competition, but where things fall apart just a little bit is the cabin noise. Measured 72.5 decibels in here, sometimes 73 depending on the road surface, so this is definitely a little bit louder than average, and you will certainly notice more engine noise in the cabin. If I slow down here again, the engine is a little bit gruff. I think that it doesn't sound quite as interesting as the engine that we find in the Chevy Trax. It has a little bit of a sewing machine vibe going on there here and there, but it's not overly objectionable. And the counterpoint to that is excellent fuel economy, but averaging 31.3 miles per gallon over a week of mixed driving in this all-wheel drive model. You will get slightly better fuel economy in the front-wheel drive model because even in the standard mode, or Eco mode, if I move that over to the Eco mode, you will notice that it doesn't completely disable the front axle, like we do find in some GM vehicles. So if you're looking, for instance, at a Chevy Trailblazer, keep in mind that that model will actually disable the rear axle until you press the all-wheel drive button. And in all-wheel drive mode, it's going to be very heavily skewed towards the front axle and only engage the rear when it's absolutely required. In that model, if you have all-wheel drive and you don't press that button, it will just sit there and spin and spin and spin the front wheels. This takes that out of the equation, that user entry out of the equation, and it's just going to be automatic. The downside to that is that they're probably giving up just a fraction of an MPG. Bottom line, out on the road, Nissan did a fantastic job, I think, with the Kicks. How reliable will the CVT be over time? I know a lot of folks ask about that. To be honest, we just don't know because it's a new vehicle and a brand new transmission design. Nissan says that they have worked through the kinks and that a lot of those problems that people reported about earlier Nissan CVTs have not applied to Nissan CVTs for a while, but honestly, the jury is still out there. On the other hand, the jury is not out on pricing and value, so let's take a deep dive into that because this is one of the best new small car values in America.
As with the previous generation, Nissan has priced this Kicks very aggressively. Not just the starting price, but the entire pricing lineup, and we're already seeing deals on new models happening around the US right now. So when you take a look at the price tag, keep in mind you're probably going to get a few $100s at least off of the Kicks, whereas you're going to be getting an HR-V or a Corolla Cross for a lot closer to MSRP. Including destination, it's going to start at $23,220. That's on the low side for this segment, especially considering that not all of the options that you might be cross-shopping are available with all-wheel drive. That's one of the big differentiators between this and something like a Hyundai Venue or, of course, a Chevy Trax. That means this is one of the very few new vehicles for 2025 you can buy out the door, including the average sales tax cost and the average licensing cost in the U.S. for under $25,000. All you have to spend, $25K, you can get yourself a base Kicks. Just keep in mind it's not going to have some of the features that you might be looking for in your next vehicle like Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. You don't find those in the base model. However, you will find a pretty decent value in the fully loaded version like we were driving today. It's going to be around $32,500 with optional paint, the premium package, which includes the sunroof, the Bose audio system, and that all-important spare tire. This pricing chart is definitely cluttered, but it is by no means an exhaustive list of competitors. There are a ton of great small SUVs in America, and if you want to broaden that out to hatchbacks, as we will be doing here shortly, there are even more competitors that you could be cross-shopping against the new Kicks. Let's take a look first, though, at the Chevy competition, because General Motors has a runaway sales success with their small SUVs, and that would be not just the Trailblazer, but the Trailblazer, the Trax, the Envista, Invista and the Encore GX. I'm kind of lumping all of these in here together because they're basically the same vehicle. They're variants of the same small SUV platform. They're all selling extremely well. The Trax sold over 200,000 units last year, and combined, this group sold over 400,000 small SUVs. Now, there are some things to keep in mind. The Trax and the Invista, those are front-wheel drive only. They also use only the 1.2-liter 3-cylinder turbo engine and a 6-speed automatic transmission. The Trailblazer, it's a bit more expensive. It allows you to select all-wheel drive. It does not come with it standard, and here we get different transmissions. The reason, according to GM, is that the CVT and the 9-speed automatic are more expensive to build, therefore they justify the higher price tag. But you should know that that front-wheel drive model will have a CVT in the Trailblazer. If you choose all-wheel drive, you'll get a 9-speed automatic. It's one of the only vehicles in this segment that has a thoroughly modern, regular, stepped automatic transmission. The Trailblazer, I also think, is pretty attractive. It's well-priced. Talk about discounts. You'll certainly find those on the Chevy dealer lot. And there are a lot of practical interior touches, like the fold-flat front passenger seat that really makes the most of the interior space. The Trax, if you don't need all-wheel drive, it's a fantastic option. It handles pretty decently. In the top trims, it handles incredibly well, to be honest. The fuel efficiency is good, and the screens inside are absolutely enormous. GM really doubled down on big screens in this generation. And I think that's why the Trax and the Trailblazer are selling so well. They're really, really strong on value. If you're considering a Trailblazer or a Trax, just keep some of the options that you might be interested in mind, like adaptive cruise control. You won't find that on every trim. And some of the options may be a little bit more difficult to track down on dealer lots because it doesn't seem like too many people are selecting those options. Also, if you get carried away with options, you can get a little bit higher on the price tag side than in the Kicks. You'll end up at $35,320 for a fully loaded Trailblazer, which is going to be about $3,000 or so more than the Kicks. The next option we have to talk about is the combination of hatchback and crossover. Well, to be honest, really just hatchback and lifted hatchback, and that's the Subaru Impreza and the Subaru Crosstrek. These are basically the same vehicle. One's just higher off the ground than the other, and the Crosstrek is a little bit more expensive, comparably equipped than the Impreza, I guess because black body cladding costs more. Whatever the reason, the Crosstrek is more expensive. And I think that the Impreza is a bit better looking because it doesn't have that black body cladding. And logically, if you wanted to lift your Impreza to Crosstrek height, you can, because it's exactly what the Crosstrek is. Anyway, we get low starting prices here. We get a lot of standard equipment like standard all-wheel drive. We also get a standard 2-screen 7-inch infotainment system. Now, that one is a little bit kooky to me because you could get the 11.6-inch screen in that base model. That would make more sense to me from a Subaru manufacturing standpoint, but for some reason, only the base version gets that display. Other things to know: the Impreza has the choice of 2 different engines, and basically in the Crosstrek, those same 2 engines as well. The 2-liter Boxer and the 2.5-liter Boxer. So if you want more power than you find in the Kicks, you can get that available in the Impreza and the Crosstrek. Also, the pricing here is pretty decent. $24,115 starting gets you all-wheel drive in the Impreza, and if you fully load a Wilderness Crosstrek, you'll end up at $35,810. Now, admittedly, that is more than a Kicks, but we're talking about a more off-road oriented vehicle. We have some underbody protection, we have the all-terrain tires, the extra body cladding, the orange bits, etc. It's kind of a different market. And comparably equipped, you'll find that the Subaru is actually a pretty decent deal. I'll try and speed through the rest of the competition just so we can include a few more in this ranking. The Corolla Cross, the big advantage there is the hybrid system. Now, if you choose the hybrid, you do lose the spare tire, but otherwise, I think the Corolla Cross comes across as a little bit dated style-wise, but definitely solid, especially if you want better fuel economy and higher reliability. It's going to cost you, though, because it is more expensive. The Honda HR-V, I think this generation of HR-V is a little bit less impressive from a packaging standpoint, so the interior feels tighter. It also is a little sluggish because it gained a lot of weight. It also gained a lot of size on the outside, which makes it look attractive. I think the HRV is really solid looking, but on the inside, it's not as practical as it once was. It's also certainly pricey for the base model, starting at $26,795, considerably more than the Kicks. Then we have the Kia Seltos. Some of this applies to the Hyundai Kona as well. The Seltos, I think, is a solid option. It no longer comes with all-wheel drive standard. It's now an option. It starts at $25,965, which is more expensive, but you get more standard feature content in that Seltos. I also like the way the Seltos drives. It's a bit more upright, a bit more regular SUV looking in its nature, and you can get the optional turbocharged engine in that model as well. Although the Seltos comes standard with a continuously variable automatic transmission, this is one of the few options that has a regular automatic. Also, with a regular automatic is the Volkswagen Taos. For 2025, they've refreshed it, and they deleted the old engine and transmission combo, so now, if you choose all-wheel drive, you get a regular automatic, not the DCT that it used to come with. On the downside, it got more expensive. It starts at $26,420 and will go up over $36,000 fully loaded. I think the new look on the Taos is really decent. Stay tuned because hopefully we'll be driving that soon. Next up is the Mazda CX-30. This has long been one of my favorites in this segment because even though it has some of the things that I complain about in other Mazda models, it doesn't really affect the CX-30 because it's so much less expensive, and it's competing in a pool where none of those things are different in the competition. Yes, it has a 6-speed automatic, and that's a number of gears behind something like a Trailblazer, but really nobody else has more than 6 speeds by and large in this segment. There are a few 8 speeds out there, not too many. CVTs are generally more common in this segment. And the 6-speed is definitely more fun in the CX-30. Also, we get significantly more power, even in the base model with that regular 2.5-liter engine. And then you can get the bonkers 250 horsepower engine in the CX-30 as well. Now, the one weird twist with the CX-30 is no independent rear suspension, even if you choose all-wheel drive. And that is typically one of the areas we see changes in this segment. Usually the front-wheel drive options have a non or a semi-independent rear, and then the all-wheel drive options have a fully independent rear. On the CX-30, it's the semi-independent variety in all trims. That does hamper actual handling ability, especially on rougher roads, but CX-30 is just so much fun and so good-looking, I don't think it really matters too much. And I also forgive its price tag, because it is more expensive than average too, starting at $26,415, going on up to almost $39,000 fully loaded. But keep that $39,000 price tag in mind when you also assess the 250 horsepower. So about 100 more horsepower in that top-end trim than is average in this segment. My bottom line for the Kicks is that Nissan has done a really solid job elevating the Kicks. Have they done enough, though? I am a little bit uncertain about that still, because it doesn't exactly differentiate itself from the competition in too many ways other than styling and maybe a little bit of the nice touches like the Bose personal audio system, which I do really like. But you'll find big screens in the competitors. You'll find aggressive styling in the competitors as well. You'll find decent fuel economy in the competitors and even value pricing in something like the Chevy Trailblazer, which is probably why the Trailblazer is selling really quite well. And if you want even more value pricing, that's the Chevy Trax, which has somehow managed to sell about 200,000 units so far this year. Don't think that's too hard to understand why, and that's probably why that was also one of our top value picks for the year last year in 2024. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and how do you think the Kicks slots up against these? Is the style enough? Is the fuel economy enough? Is that Bose audio system enough? The seats are pretty comfortable. It's a very easy to live with vehicle, but you know, some of these other competitors, they're also pretty easy to live with. See all of you later.